Let's have a close-up look at some of the accessories that we're going to use to make wire-to-wire connections and wire-to-fixture connections. So before we go about acquiring these parts and pieces, we need to kind of start with our wire and make a determination as to what that wire size is. So I can't get close enough with this, with the camera that I'm using to show you this, but printed along the length of these wires will be its wire gauge and some other particulars about its maximum voltage and about whether or not it's designed to be used around oil or gasoline. So here we have a red wire that is 12 gauge. And it is going to, and this 12 gauge wire is solid wire. So I've got one piece of 12 gauge solid red wire, and this, again, any color other than black, green, or white can be used for a switch leg, or it can be the wire that goes from an outlet to a switch or from a switch to a device. So we're going to go through attaching a terminal onto the end of that wire, and this is what's called a spade terminal. They also have hooks that would allow you to get in around a post or pole like we have here, because it is often the case that these screws don't back all the way out. They back most of the way out, so you would need to be able to hook around that rather than dropping over the top. So we're going to look at the application of terminals. We're going to look at the application of splices that would allow us to join two pieces of wire together. And we also have a little piece of shrink tube here. We're going to look at wire nuts, which are typically used in that octagonal junction box that I showed you earlier to make a connection between two pieces of wire. And we're going to go into detail about these electrician's pliers and demonstrate how those are used. And then we're going to wrap it up by putting some tape around some of those connections we made for additional security. Now that we're in for a closer look, I wanted to again show you this screwdriver, which has a wedging action. As you push forward, it pulls these two tines together, which causes them to expand in the slot. So it allows you to be able to hold on to a screw like this and reach into a space that you couldn't get your hands into. But again, we would only ever use a screwdriver that's rated for working with electricity if we were working around any live current. So let's look at these electrician's pliers. So what do we got? We have a series of wire strippers, and there are the wire gauge numbers located on here, starting with 22 to 20 gauge, 18 gauge, 16 gauge, 14 gauge, 12 gauge, and 10 gauge. So these are the wire strippers. These are the crimpers that are used for securing these splices in place. There are also through holes for the screws that are most commonly used by electricians, which include 1032, 832, 632, 440, and 1024. And these are really useful because it allows me to be able to take a screw and thread it into the first hole, let it pass through the second, and then shear that screw off to length. So we'll do a quick demo on that. And then there is a cutter located on the end of the pliers here. So let's start with our 12 gauge. So I'm going to take my wire. I'm going to find my 12 gauge position on that wire. I'm going to squeeze and then rotate back and forth, and then just like that, it strips away that excess plastic, exposing as much wire as is necessary for whatever you happen to be doing. So I've bent that wire around to create a loop, and that loop can then be attached to a terminal and screwed down in place. Now, again, a cautionary note about solid wire is that if you're bending that wire back and forth trying to manipulate it, then that wire will become brittle at the point which it is bent, and that could break away, resulting in a wire coming loose. So that's another reason why people are typically using stranded wire, because it's less prone to breaking and it's a little easier to manipulate and bend. But we could also put a terminal end on the end of our wire. So I'm back to my 12 gauge, rotate, slide it off. I take my round terminal, which has an uninsulated portion collared inside of that plastic sleeve. I'm going to trim this down just a hair because I don't want a bunch of wire projecting out the end of it. So I'm just going to trim this off so I've got a little less wire projecting. I can sleeve on like this and crimp that in place. Okay, things like terminal ends like this and butt splices are engineered for specific sizes of wire, so we need to make sure that it is designed to be used with a particular wire size we're using. I only want enough insulation stripped back that I can get my wire fitted up in and not have any exposed bare wire. Take my crimping tool and give it a bite. And that should hold that spade securely in place. Let's take a look at how we could do a splice. I'm going to go ahead and take my piece of 14 gauge ground wire, go back to my pliers, find the 14, squeeze, rotate, and slide off. And I'm going to go ahead and cut off the excess wire that was already stripped or exposed on this side. I'll then take my butt splicer and feed in, rotating clockwise in the same direction that that wire is twisted. I'll take my other side, feed it in, and rotate clockwise. No exposed wire. Come around and crimp one side, crimp the other side, and now that's a secure splice. It is often the case that electricians that are erring on the side of caution will also go ahead and run tape around a joint like this. So we'll do a slight overlap like this, and then roll around until that splice is covered for an extra level of security. When it comes to using wire nuts to make connections, I will have to strip my wire. Now I'm working with some 20 gauge. I'll take my two ends and rotate clockwise to bring those two ends together. Then pick the wire nut that's appropriate for the size of that material and rotate it clockwise until you feel it bite in place, and that secures those two wires together. But again, best practices is that we always come back over a wire nut. Tightening was clockwise, so I want to go the same direction clockwise so I don't end up loosening that up. I'm going to hold those two wires together at the base like this and get one wrap around the two wires and then come up onto the shoulder of the nut just like that. So that's how we make a wire nut connection. The disadvantage of wire nuts is that they require more space than does a splice. But it may often be the case that you're not able to get into something like an electrical box to be able to get pliers in to make a splice like that. So we looked at the function of stripping, cutting, and crimping, but let's look at how we're able to use these to cut screws down to a specific length. So here I take my 832, I locate that position of the 832 and line those two holes up by opening the pliers into the correct position. I screw in by hand till I have it oriented in such a way that the length that I'm retaining is going to be from the center of those, or the intersection of those two sides of that piece of plier, right? And now I simply squeeze those two together and come back up, and it cuts the screw to length without marring the end of it.